Good afternoon, and there's your high tech introduction. And this is the third video lecture about James Cook, now Captain James Cook's third expedition or voyage, if you want to use the more romantic word. And I'm going to continue going through then some key events or events which are thought-provoking events from the final voyage, and also say a few words about the death of Cook, which of course led to a large number of heroic paintings and sculptures and even a musical comedy at the end of the 18th century. We were somewhere around page 531 in the Penguin abridged version of Cook's journal, and on that page, indeed, there is an interesting account of attitudes of local peoples to property, and in some places it certainly seemed to be the case that the values of the local people were that if things were interesting, they were allowed to take them, and that the idea of personal property was not structured in the same way. On the following page, 532, Cook broaches the subject of intimate relations between sailors and local women. And although he is naturally a man of his time, and so doesn't go into too many details, and indeed he was cautious. He was a little concerned when it came to the time of publishing accounts of the voyages. He was concerned that they should not be excessively explicit, and that they should keep quiet about any activity which might shock the elite of the time. Here he comes up with some comments which are rather interesting and often quoted, where he is concerned that the local people will suffer because of the venereal diseases brought in by the sailors, and in particular syphilis. And certainly they do suffer. Now, the history of syphilis is a rather interesting one, that everybody thought for a long time that the disease came from the Americas, but recent research has shown that even medieval skeletons in Britain in the 14th century quite often showed evidence of syphilis. And in fact, it seems that what had happened, that syphilis was common both in the Americas and in Europe in a milder form in previous centuries, which was not sexually transmitted. So what we had was more a transformation of an existing disease rather than the arrival of one from America. In any case, this anecdote is often quoted to show Cook's capacity to think about the interests of the local people, and therefore, in some way, to defend Cook against the idea that he was purely a tool of imperial expansion. Only the page following gives an example going in somewhat the other direction, where the one local was killed by one of Cook's men with a gun, and Cook approves of this, saying he was obliged to fire. The work of delivering European animals continues, and a ram, a goat, and 2 ewes, and a boar, and a sow pig are all delivered. And he also leaves seeds of pumpkins and onions. And there is a certain amount of trade going on. Here we are in the Hawaiian archipelago, or what he will refer to as the Sandwich Islands, not because of his Jean Mabeur, but because of the Earl of Sandwich, who was one of his sponsors. In this first visit to the Hawaiian Islands, Cook will not land on the largest island. So when he comes back a few months later, it will be his first visit to Hawaii, and of course that will be tremendously significant. The ship leaves the Hawaiian Islands and heads north, arriving at Nootka Sound, where they found that the local peoples knew the use of iron and were mostly interested in getting this. The trade is made between iron instruments and the skins of bears and wolves and foxes and deers and raccoons and polecats and what they call sea beavers, which we would refer to as otters. So a large variety. Remember, these are times when there are a lot of these animals around, a large variety of furs, and indeed Cook notes that fur trading would be good here. And we're talking about a trade which is tremendously profitable if it can be established. They're having problems with the ship on page 541, a serious problem of rotting masts. The masts are rotting, but there is lots of wood around, and they're also very interested in trading for good animal oil, which the locals conserved in animal bladders. He notes that the demand for brass by the local peoples was very strong. Indeed, he says, before we left the place, hardly a bit of brass was left on the ship, except what was in the necessary instruments, because some of the chronometers and sextants and so on have brass in them. Cook is able to visit some of the locals' houses in the following pages, and in most of the houses he speaks of there being women at work making dresses from the bark we have mentioned, because bark cloth was a very important skill. He also speaks of women smoking sardines and using wicker fish traps, and he describes these on page 544, I think. He describes these wicker fish traps, which is local technology for catching fish. So we see that the curiosity, which is one of his motivations, is certainly very much still present. There are moments of good communication. A large number of canoes came over to visit the ship, 545, and sang for them, the local concert. And there is ceremonial exchanges. For example, Cook exchanges a broadsword for a beaver skin cloak. With these kinds of ceremony. At this point, the edition notes that Cook continues with a long description of the inhabitants and how they live, but that it has been decided to omit this. So it's good that we remember that we are in the presence of an abridged text. Off they leave Nootka Sound, then they head north for several days. Some difficulty with the ship, which is still leaking, and they are now going up the coast, keeping an eye open in case any large inlet turns out to be a northwest passage, which will allow them to go all the way across to the Atlantic Ocean and transform the history of the British Empire by giving them a major advantage. Of course, we now know that they won't manage to do this. There was no Northwest Passage here. Cook may well be disappointed. Remember that apart from his own personal image and interest in a Northwest Passage and his patriotic feelings for wanting to help along the British domination of the world, there was also an enormous financial reward offered by Parliament for finding the Northwest Passage, and certainly that would be something. But nevertheless, of course, he continues with his work as an imperial scout, and he takes possession of the land in the places where he is. He makes another comment about the fur trade. There is no doubt but a very beneficial fur trade might be carried on with the inhabitants of this vast coast, but unless a northern passage is found, it seems rather too remote for Great Britain to receive any emolument from it. So there he's saying in very clear terms then the importance of the Northwest Passage to make it possible to do trading without the travel being so expensive, going round I'm not sure where they would go round, probably go round South America. Well, if you have to go round South America to get to the furs and then round South America again to bring them back, then it's more expensive than they are worth. There is here a link with another civilization on the other side of the world because they receive a message which has been left for them, or been left for Europeans in any case, from previous Russian travelers, page 561. They arrive at the island of Unimak, and one of the things I wanted to underline about this island, it is 95 kilometers long and 100 kilometers wide. So I think it's important sometimes when we say island, we get the impression that it's these small islands. Some of these are very big places with a lot of people involved, and indeed this place today is a sea lion protection area up on the north coast of North America. They are still working at identifying new plants or collecting new plants. They find a plant which Cook compares to parsley and finds it good to eat, quote, either in soups or in a salad. So the culinary adventure continues. And a little later on, they come across a big island called Unalushka, and it is still today. So I imagine that would be a European imitation of the local name for it, and it is indeed today Unalaska, not Alaska, yeah, Unalaska. Some trading is going on, 565, and Cook is fascinated to see that the local peoples here do not seem to be surprised by the ship. He says, yet they seemed to be no strangers to vessels in some degree like ours. And he continues in a rather patronizing colonialist turn, they had acquired a degree of politeness uncommon to Indians. Here the Indians bring on board a note written in Russian, but unfortunately they didn't have Google Translate, and nobody on board could read Russian, so that didn't really help. They have difficult times as well. The surgeon, Anderson, dies, and this is rather a blow because, of course, the surgeon, important person. And in honor of Anderson, they named the next island as Anderson's Island. Interestingly enough, this was in fact St. Lawrence Island, already named by Bering, after whom we know the Bering Straits are named. This island, again, very big island, 80 miles long. These are not little places. They find a place which they identify as the western extremity of all America hitherto known, and they name it the Cape Prince of Wales. This is page 568, and it is indeed the western extremity. It is still today called Cape Prince of Wales, and when they name this place, they are only 70 miles from Siberia, so from the eastern coast of Russia. They have some conflict with local peoples. When they arrive at the next place they visit, they find 3 armed boats, 40 or 50 men, armed with bows and arrows, and he's able to look at the arrows and the spears, and he says, quote, the arrows were appointed with either bone or stone. And I think I already mentioned that before. If you don't have the capacity to get iron or bronze from ore, then bone or stone is about your only options, both of which are not as easy to work as iron. However, he says that the spears that the locals have were made of iron or steel and were of European or Asiatic workmanship. That's fairly easy conclusion to draw on, because they have not yet come across any local peoples who have the technology to produce metal objects. These weapons were also ceremonial in style, and he mentions that the arrows of the local peoples were carried in beautiful ornamented red leather quivers, and that the locals were wearing fur clothes and caps. He is able to visit local habitations, and he speaks of what they looked like. There's the winter habitations and the summer huts. The summer huts was a collective dwelling with animal skin partitions. I'm sure we know a lot more about this kind of habitat now. Perhaps the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris would tell us some more about it. And he notes that the main form of transport is the sledges drawn by dogs, although the dogs may also be used for eating. He is at this moment rather annoyed at the very bad maps which he's having to use, that he's gone out there with a set of maps, but in fact they don't correspond to what he's really finding, and he complains about that. And he also takes the opportunity right now to measure the longitude. Now, observation of the moon, the traditional lunar observation, lunar distance method, gave the longitude as 197 degrees 41 minutes east, whereas according to the chronometer, according to the watch, using a different method of calculation, it was 198 degrees east. This is several miles difference, and we have already spoken about how dangerous it can be to be at sea and not be sure where exactly you are. This is now we're up to 574. This is a part of the North America, of course, where it's very cold. The ice is dangerous. They're not sure how much further they'll be able to go north, but they're working very hard at trying to see if there is a passage towards the east across the continent. So is there a passage through the ice? They are able to have a little bit of a different meal because, of course, on the ship they're mostly surviving on salt meat, which is just not particularly exciting. And they catch some walrus, and they find that this is better than salt meat, but not really very good to eat. However, the heart of the walrus was tasty. Si vous avez déjà mangé du cœur de morse, vous saurez. And the hides they used for the rigging, they made sails out of the hides, and the oil was from the fat of the walruses it burned well for the lamps. So they are discovering things about what you can do with walruses. There were a lot of walruses around. He said that the walruses lay in herds of many hundreds upon the ice. So I think we can see here how we can imagine how excited the crew must be, who of course will never have seen a walrus in Yorkshire or in London, and here they are with these views of hundreds and hundreds of walruses laying around on the ice. They spent 8 more days looking for a passage through the ice, so now they've been spending weeks and weeks going up the coastline, desperately hoping there'll be a northwest passage. They haven't found one, and so they decide to go south for the winter. Because, as the winter is setting in, there's going to be more and more ice, so they decide to go south for the winter. And so they managed to get the ships full of wood, and he says about 12 tons of water for each ship. So remember that keeping hold of fresh water and getting fresh water, tremendously important. And they were also able to collect large amounts of berries and enormous fish. He mentioned a halibut, which weighed 254 pounds. It's enormous. That's well over 100 kilograms. They decide then, or Cook decides really, because he doesn't always even tell the rest of the crew where he's going to go. He decides where he's going. He decides to head for the Sandwich Islands for the winter. The Sandwich Islands, then the Hawaiian Islands. They are able to make contact with a few Russians who were seamen and furriers who sold furs. They came to say hello, and one of the Russians told of his travels in the Bering Sea and of a remarkable expedition to Japan, China, and France. There are some considerations of etiquette, because the Russian presented to Cook an expensive otter skin, which Cook refused because he considered it was not proper to accept such an expensive present. The Russians, however, were very helpful to them, that they had a series of maps which had never been published, and they allowed Cook's crew to copy the unpublished charts, which gave a lot of interesting information and, among other things, showed very clearly that Alaska was not an island, because many of the maps at the time showed Alaska as an island. In return, Cook gave to the Russians a Hadley's octant, which they had never before seen. Yes, an octant. Well, we've within the what's the word? The maritime instruments are used to, if I understand correctly, sight the stars and help calculate your position. You have the quadrant, the sextant, and the octant. And the octant, I believe, is the most accurate, but I'm really not an expert on this. And so he gave them a Hadley's octant, which they must have found very valuable because they've never seen one before. And he ends with a comment about the character of the Russians, which remains their reputation to this day. He said the Russians were very friendly and they liked to drink. He also describes the system of native servants and slaves that is in existence in the Russian settlements, which had been set up there for the fur trade. So that's quite interesting. He is very interested anthropologically. He wants to describe the Russian ways of doing things, just like he wants to describe, without knowledge of the language, the local First Nations ways of doing things. But also, unsurprisingly for a naval officer of his time, there is of course no comment showing that he's in any way shocked by the slaves, by the existence of slavery, and indeed it would be very surprising if he was, as a naval officer at the time. So down they go, and they get as far as the island chain of the Sandwich Islands, the Hawaiian Islands, and they go around one or two islands and have some trade before making anchor in Kealakekua Bay in January 1779, and we now know that they were tremendously well welcomed and showered with gifts and the best food. And when Cook went abroad, went on land, he was extremely well received. And here, the captain of the other ship said that the reception, quotes, exceeded everything we had ever before met with. And he also says when Cook went ashore, he was treated with a respect, I quote, which more resembled that due to a deity than a human being. Indeed, it has been suggested, although this is no longer the favourite theory of historians, that Cook was taken to be a god since he arrived in the middle of a particular religious season dedicated to the god Lono. And it's difficult for us to be sure about that, but certainly he may have been considered to be a representative of the god in some way. You also need to remember how tremendously impressive for local peoples the arrival of this enormous floating ship, enormous compared with what they had seen in the past, with the fireworks, with the firearms, with the metal tools, and so on. After staying for some time, and it has been for a few weeks, and it has been suggested consuming more than the natives could actually afford to give them. It has been suggested by some historians that they certainly by the time they left, the local peoples were giving signs that they wanted them to leave, but it has been suggested that this is also about how much they consumed. But indeed, after they left, the festival season has ended, and a new season under the worship and rituals of the god of war had begun, and so it may well be that when they came back a few weeks later, the timing of their return was particularly difficult. At this time, there was one American on board Cook's ship at the time, and he wrote a detailed account in his journals, and we will be looking at some aspects of that. So on the 6th of February, they left Kealakekwa Bay, and they had a tremendous piece of bad luck because a tremendous gale wrenched the main mast of the Resolution, the main mast, the central wooden support for the rigging, and so they felt they had little choice but to come back to Hawaii. And Ledyard, the American, wrote on the 13th of February about what happened next. Basically, when they came back, they were not welcomed, and as Ledyard writes, while anchored in the bay, one of only 2 longboats was stolen by the Hawaiians. And Cook reacted with anger, and he tried a tactic which he had previously tried elsewhere. He went along and attempted to kidnap a local notable in order to oblige whoever had taken the longboat to bring it back. So they marched the ruler out of the royal enclosure and took him down toward the beach. But there were more and more local peoples. Indeed, Ledyard says thousands of native Hawaiians came to see it, and the noble Kalaniopu refused to get onto the ship and be kidnapped and cooperate with this tactic. There is a fight. Some of Cook's people open fire. And Cook is stabbed and killed with an iron knife. The remaining sailors and marines fired as they fled to their small boat and rowed back to the ship, injuring and killing dozens of native Hawaiians on the beach. Now, the ships did not leave the bay after Cook's death. The ships did not leave the bay until the 22nd of February, so they remained another week because they were obliged to repair the mast and collect better quality drinking water. And according to the Americans' journals, hundreds of local peoples were shot in a series of ongoing skirmishes, and the ship's cannon was used against the natives, and a large portion of their town was burned down in revenge. Now, a lot has been written about Cook's deaths, and many different interpretations have been suggested, both to explain why he came to be killed and also whose fault it was. And indeed, the death of James Cook in many ways made him more of a hero, a sacrificial hero. And he has been painted as the captain killed by those native peoples who he loved so much, which are fundamentally fictional representations of his death. Now, from one point of view, there is nothing to explain. If you wander around taking possessions of people's lands, sooner or later someone will get annoyed with you. The expeditions of Cook were risky activities. There is no need for a special explanation as to why at this moment things went badly for him. If every Saturday night you drink a bottle of whiskey and then drive home, you may be fine week after week after week, and then one night you have a road accident and you're killed. That doesn't mean we need a special explanation about what went wrong on that Saturday night. Now, there are a number of mysteries about his death. Perhaps that's a lot to say. For example, Cook stopped writing his accounts in his journal a couple of weeks before his death. However, there are. It seems clear that some pages were lost. and we don't know why or how. Now, I put on the blog very recently an article about this particular question. In any case, the death of Captain Cook has been the subject of lively debate since the 1980s, where the traditional colonialist representation as Cook as a sacrificed martyr to the Enlightenment is no longer generally accepted. Sections of First Nation opinion celebrate the fact that they finally gave him what he deserved. And this debate continues. What else do I have to say about that? Yes, so some people have tried to add psychological explanations for Cook's decline and death. It's certainly been pointed out that Cook was far more violent during the third expedition than he had been previously. His behavior, say many, became more erratic and unpredictable, resulting in threats, beatings and death, which he did not himself always describe in detail. For example, it's clearly shown that there was far more flogging on the third expedition than on the previous ones. One particular writer, Makoviak, wrote his article, which has been circulated rather a lot. It's called Post-Traumatic Stress Reactions Before the Advent of Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder: Potential Effects on the Lives and Legacies of Alexander the Great, Captain James Cook, Emily Dickinson and Florence Nightingale. This gentleman concludes that Cook's psychological collapse after his second voyage of discovery ended his days as an effective explorer. Although enraged Hawaiians killed him, it was his erratic post-traumatic behavior that precipitated the melee in which he died. This is a quotation from Makoviak. This is a quotation from Makoviak. Now, there are a number of things I would like to say about this. First of all, it's difficult for us to analyse with any hope of success this psychology of an 18th century naval officer. Further, personally, I don't find Makoviak's work very convincing. Indeed, the title, where he writes one article where he deals with supposed post-traumatic stress disorder on Alexander the Great, Captain James Cook, Emily Dickinson and Florence Nightingale, does not really suggest a serious historical approach. Further, it may be that aging naval officers often became more violent, more grumpy, and more angry people. Difficult to say, but certainly I would be very hesitant about putting too much credence on this particular view of Cook's psychological decline causing his death. That's good timing because I just got to the end of the third expedition. There will be other videos. I'm not quite sure on what subjects yet, but I will know soon. And of course, remember to look at John Mullen's teaching blog to have more links to articles, videos, and so on. Thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye for now.